Dear visitors, dear students, and dear audience online, right now and later on, because it will not be only streamed but also recorded. So welcome to today's lecture. In the spirit of European values, Bulgaria-North Macedonia's dispute over history and memory. I don't want to talk too long. Maybe 3 minutes to tell you in which context we are doing this. So the first and most important thing to mention, Naum Trajanovski, welcome to you again, is a guest professor at Viadrina in this winter term. He has been invited through funds of the Meyer Struckmann Stiftung, a German foundation, which has actually supported Viadrina in a series of events. This one now is a series of altogether 3 guest professorships. The first one is now the one Naum is holding. In this guest professorship, we try to link 2 things which are important to us at the moment. One is we have a Jean Monnet network of European values. It's spelled ValEUs, so values of the European Union, if you wish. This is a big network of 20 universities in 17 countries, and we have one guiding question, so to say, which is you have these series of European values, for example, Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, but in the practices of the EU or of politicians in Europe which refer to the EU, many of these values are not pursued, are heard, are not proposed fully. Yeah, so you have a value gap. In the sense of that the realized values differ from the one which are proposed. And our question is, what are the effects of this? Yeah, especially in a European Union which argues itself, whose political leaders argue themselves that they are a value-based international organization, supranational organization. If you base yourself so much on norms and on values, what happens if these values are incomplete, or are pursued in an incomplete manner? So this is the guiding question, and the Meyer Struckmann Stiftung now gave us some funds for a guest professor to link this topic to also practice-related issues and elements. Yeah, so what we did not want was just somebody who teaches on European values, but who is able to enact them and to deal with them on a practice-oriented level. This is why Naum is here very successfully, as I hear. He has been an adjunct faculty member in Warsaw at the Faculty of Sociology until 2025. And at the Institute of Social Studies of Warsaw University 2025 to 2027. Born in Skopje, as you see from the topic, heavily involved in memory politics and other value-oriented elements of Southeast Europe. I noted 2 of his recent books. Yeah, the one will appear next year, or this year, it's 2026, the History of Macedonian Sociology. It's already out, so okay, it says 2026 in your CV, so it's already out. And then 2022, Remembering the 2001 Armed Conflict in Macedonia. So I just wanted to, there's more to say. You can find it also on the homepage of the European Studies program, obviously, but I don't want to be too long because we only have until 2 o'clock sharp. Students here have to move on to go to their courses, and this is why I want to hand it over to you. Thank you again for being with us, not only for sharing your insights today, but also for conducting such a great seminar. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. I hope everything is fine with the microphone. Yes, so without further ado, I will just deep dive into what I have prepared for today, and then maybe we will kind of raise some other issues, even concerning the seminar which we're doing right now at Viadrina. So yes, in 2017, Bulgaria and the then Republic of Macedonia signed a bilateral treaty of friendship, good neighborliness, and cooperation. And beside the focus on improving the political and the economic ties between the two countries, the treaty also sought to somehow address these long-standing disputes between the two states concerning memory, history, and other sort of related issues, with the main kind of point here, of course, banalized, being that the Bulgaria is in fact not fully recognizing the Macedonian nation, recognizing the Macedonian state, but not recognizing fully the Macedonian language, ethnic identity, and nation in a way, deeming them all Bulgarian. So in this regards, in 2017, with this particular treaty, a bilateral joint multidisciplinary expert commission on historical and educational issues was thereby established and tasked with identifying historical figures suitable for official joint, in a way, commemorations, and also mitigating these negative portrayals of history, events, and figures in the history textbooks of the two kind of states. And this, of course, was done on a parity basis, so the equal number of members in the commission from both the sides. Notably, also the treaty stipulated this sort of idea that the commission should operate in this kind of domain of and the spirit of the European values. The following decade after 2017, like more or less until nowadays, showed, however, that despite this very brief initial progress, its work stalled, and in a way things went south afterwards. So in October 2020, Bulgaria blocked the formal opening of North Macedonia's EU accession talks, citing its different kind of interpretations of the notion of shared history as in the treaty, and in a way Skopje's denial of the alleged Bulgarian roots of the Macedonian language and ethnicity. So while a tentative breakthrough occurred at the end of the French EU presidency in 2022, resulting in Bulgaria de facto lifting its veto, North Macedonia in a way remained obliged to constitutionally recognize its Bulgarian minority, and that things are more or less at this status quo at this point. So as a very brief side note, this was not the first unsuccessful attempt at establishing dialogue and institutionalizing a platform in a way between the two states. In the 1960s, of course, in a different kind of state building, still state context, high-level officials talks resulted in a certain concession from the Macedonian side, drawing upon the emerging sociological scholarship that traced Macedonian ethnogenesis to the 19th century and not further back in time. And this scholarly turn, in a way, contributed to the autonomization of sociology as a distinct discipline within the Macedonian context. And this is an episode which I discuss in greater detail in my monograph, which Tim mentioned. More recently, the bilateral relations appeared to improve with the signing of the joint declaration between the two states in 1999. And this was again done prior to Bulgaria's accession to the European Union. And in this declaration, both the states affirmed in a way that no outstanding bilateral issues existed between them. And this kind of history of bilateral issues is best reviewed, in my opinion, and the opinions of others, in this chapter, Marinov's book, which in a way provides this kind of very complex, comprehensive and nuanced understanding of this sort of relations. The critical juncture, of course, this should be mentioned, leading to the most recent escalation in the late 2010s, was the 2018 agreement between Macedonia and Greece back then, which not only changed the state name of the former to North Macedonia, but also allowed for certain official recognition of different historical perspectives. So it kind of provided this sort of legitimacy to the two kind of different national interpretations over the domain of Macedonia, Macedonians, and so on. And official Sofia interpreted this kind of development as an evidence of the North Macedonia's already willingness to kind of make these concessions regarding its past in pursuit of EU membership. So this is more or less the critical context. And what followed, and this is also again like a brief kind of mapping of the situation, was this rapid deterioration of the relations between the two states, and particularly between the societies, as this is something which kind of was a logical follow-up. So in Bulgaria, even though not a central issue, the renewed bilateral tensions contributed to the government's collapse in 2021 and to this kind of continuous political crisis marked by a series of 7 more or less elections since 2021, with another one scheduled this year actually. So in North Macedonia in turn, whose developments are primarily in the focus of today's talk, the stalling of EU accession and the emergence of new demands from neighboring states, this time from east, not from south, not from Greece, significantly reshaped the behavior of a range of social and political actors, which started to question in a way the European values in the bilateral relations and the EU integrations, and in a way this led to a de facto freezing of this process under this present government, which actually kind of came to power on this very anti-concession sort of platform in 2024. So what is today's agenda? So today I'll try to map 3 such developments, research in a way kind of perspectives, each one stemming from a separate research project of mine. And the first one in this regards examines the securitization of history and memory by intellectuals in intellectual circles, more or less formal, and this is something which we've done together with Ivan Nikolovski, who is a PhD candidate at the Central European University in Vienna. And in this kind of perspective, in this slide, we argued that in situations where intellectuals perceive the states as having responded inadequately to real or perceived threats to national identities, they often position themselves as some sort of an alternative line of defense through practices of social security seeking, effectively securitizing foundational national narratives in turn. So I will illustrate these dynamics through the process of marking the national red lines in the Macedonian context, which kind of, in a way, in very brief, rendered discussion about what stays Macedonian historical tradition and so on, effectively impermissible, so kind of putting this sort of red lines of what is to be discussed or not. So this sort of this process is the first point of today's talk. Secondly, I'll turn to public commemorations as platforms for forging social and political coalitions around issues of history and memory, and importantly enough, very much linked to the above, to the before kind of to this process of intellectual securitization which I mentioned before. So here I focus on the recent commemorations of Goce Delchev, who is a historical figure revered in both the states, and I will say a few words about him as well in this historical sense, as an example of how such events actually shape and structure public debate. And finally, I'll present a very recent findings of something which we did very recently, and which draws on focus group interviews with non-experts in Skopje. So in a way, lay people with no formal training in history, just to demonstrate how this sort of development, rather public, rather intellectual, and rather involving kind of sort of better public visibility, how this actually resonated with the lay people, and how it actually informed, or it didn't inform, the ways in which they acquire and negotiate and in a way circulate historical knowledge. So let me start with the first point. So the informed public debate following the Macedonian-Bulgarian relations after 2017, so after in a way the treaty, was mostly focused on the work on the joint commission, which up until the Bulgarian escalation had even several breakthroughs, as I already hinted, which were mostly related to the ancient and the medieval past. The new tensions shifted this sort of historical focus they covered to the very role of the commission itself. So instead of discussing what the commission was discussing, they were actually discussing the work of the Commission. It is like the very existence, the point of its existence. So in North Macedonia, it's like important to be highlighted. This first lineup of the Commission was, in a way, mostly consisted of younger, relatively, cohort of historians. The important thing is that they were mostly trained abroad and with a certain kind of experience or subspecialization in researching history textbooks. And in a way, this kind of more of a memory issues. It also had one anthropologist / ethnologist, and like in a way, the majority of their public comments, in a way, they resonated with this sort of social constructivist logics, namely that it would be ahistorical to kind of claim or project the national past to the period beyond the nation building. So this is more or less clear. This in turn, so after the Bulgarian memorandum in 2020, contributed to the kind of depicting its public image of the Macedonian part of the Commission as an instrument for granting concessions over historical events and figures to the Bulgarian side. And yes, so very, very timely change of the slides by itself. So yes, so one such early reaction was the publishing of the so-called Macedonian Manifesto in December 2020, which was co-signed by the Macedonian Academy of Sciences and Arts, the Macedonian Orthodox Church, and the Skopje University. And this was, again, the context, the critical context was the passing of the Bulgarian memorandum. The manifesto called the national government to build upon the national knowledge production when negotiating over history and memory issues, as, in a way, already at this point, as a way of unlocking the EU integration. So by the end of next year, however, similar initiatives multiplied, now increasingly focused on the work, on the very work of the commissions. And in a way, this is something which we show with Ivan by kind of close reading of documents and papers and other sort of publications, that these attacks are, in a way, they differed on several critical bases. So older cohorts of historians, mostly trained in state socialist Macedonia, completely denounced the work of the Joint Commission, deeming at certain stances the historians of the Commission as some sort of language of betrayal, a national kind of behavior, and so on, while younger cohorts of historians with certain experience in sort of regional cooperation projects, and there were several critical ones since the 2000s, were more careful in this kind of assessments, and they were rather pointing out to the failed such platforms from the past years. The common denominator here was this tendency to close the gap on what is and what is not to be discussed, often as an undeniable truth, which in a way was a significant step back from these early arguments of the manifesto itself, which you can see highlighted here, which in a way stipulated this sort of pluralist understanding of history. But in a way, this tendency to radicalize the demands soon translated into politics, mostly showing how this consensus about the national red lines intended to reassure Macedonians that their government will not yield identity-related demands to the Bulgarian side. In October that year, one member of the Macedonian part of the Joint Commission had left his position in a pretty public manner, claiming political pressures and renunciation of the so-called red lines. The 1 full year, more or less, was also enough to articulate parallel expertise over the historical figures and episodes discussed and apparently agreed upon the Commission members. And this climate of kind of resentment towards the work of the Commission culminated in the peak of the heated discussions about lifting the de facto veto, Bulgarian veto, in mid-2022, when even pro-EU think tanks in North Macedonia joined the ranks of the defenders of the red lines kind of politics. And in a way, this also was reaffirmed by the Prime Minister at that point, Dimitar Kovačevski, who came from the Social Democrats, and he also, in a way, recreated this language of respecting the red lines in the negotiations with the European Union. So, this, in a way, intellectual securitization projects also sought not only to kind of move towards the political field, but they also sought to mobilize wider support for their work, and in a way this was sold in several instances as a specific kind of particular kind of intellectual product. So in a way to kind of popularize this sort of demands. And this, in kind of mine and in our joint understanding with Ivan, this was more or less done and formatted during this sort of particular set of commemorative events. The first one, which I will in a way try to show today. And this is important to kind of understand who this commemoration was about. So I will briefly, just very, very briefly, sketch this sort of historical context for the figure of Goce Delchev, who in a way, as I mentioned, tells this very illustrative story in this regard. So he was born in 1872 and soon emerged as a pivotal figure of the early Macedonian revolutionary movement, serving as this sort of spiritus movens of the struggle for Macedonian autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. So we're speaking about the late 19th century. He was ambushed and killed by the Ottoman forces in May 1903. It's only months before this sort of major anti-Ottoman uprising on the territory of today's Macedonia, the Ilinden uprising in August 1903. So his remains were moved multiple times in the decades that followed, spending much of the interwar period under the care of the Macedonian community in Sofia, while his name continued to inspire activists of different ideological leanings, mostly kind of related to these different sort of models of the Macedonian revolutionary movement up until the mid-30s. In the aftermath of the Second World War, so this sort of brief episode of improved relations between Bulgaria and Yugoslavia created these conditions for fulfilling Delchev's last wish, final wish in a way, that is to be laid to rest in the soil of a free Macedonian state. And this eventually took place in October of 1946 as a profoundly symbolic and ceremonial act. And in a series of events, his remains were departed Sofia on 7th of October on 46, passed through this sort of region of borderland region between Macedonia and Bulgaria called Pirin Macedonia or Petric, and arrived in Skopje on 10th of October, where they were enshrined in the church of Saint Spas in Skopje, which is one of the oldest surviving Orthodox churches in the city and has, in a way, a symbolic value. The following day, 11th of October, commemorated as the start of the anti-fascist uprising in Macedonia, saw this unveiling of his monument in Skopje City Park, and this in a way was imagined as this series of critical events pertaining to the new kind of Macedonian state at this point. Back to the more recent times, so in May 2019, Goce Delchev was officially commemorated in Skopje with the participation of a high-level Bulgarian delegation for the first time in North Macedonia's history, given this sort of history of bilateral dynamism of the majority of the post-war period, where actually these sort of issues were kind of remained not pretty much touched by these political elites at this sort of sense. So the ceremony took place at Delchev's sarcophagus at the church which I mentioned, and this event was in a way imagined and designed to be part of this broader efforts to rebuild bilateral relations after the signing of the treaty in 2017, including, and this is again a pretty critical event, including the then Bulgarian Prime Minister Boyko Borisov's participation in the 2018 Skopje ceremony honoring Macedonian Jews, which were eventually deported during the Holocaust. And in a way, despite this kind of initiative, kind of in the sense of Brandtian tournament kind of maneuver, Borisov failed to kind of deliver, articulate any sort of atonement for the Bulgarian participation in the deportations, which in a way was considered as not fully kind of serving its role in this sense. Nevertheless, it's one of the key events which also in a way was paving the way for what will come afterwards. So by 2020, however, and this is again the period in which this sort of recent escalation took place, much in line with these intellectual pleas concerning securitization of Macedonian history and past, Public commemorations became flashpoints for showcasing the resentment with the process of the bilateral reconciliation itself. So at the May 2020 commemoration of Delchev, the governmental and presidential delegations laying flowers to the sarcophagus were booed, while oppositional figures attended a public debate marking the very same occasion, which was critical in a way of the work of the commission, deeming its task denationalizing the national past and so on. So in September 2020, the then oppositional right-wing party, which is now in power, organized this big anti-governmental protest under the slogan, "Delchev is our last fortress and we will not give an inch." And you can see here, for instance, one of some of the slogans circulated during these events. So in a way, the case of Delchev's recent commemoration shows that the kind of the potential of how a certain historical figure can function as what sociologist Mabel Berezin deems a template of possibility that collectivities experience as, in a way, as some sort of political facts. So the very fact that Delchev's sarcophagus at the Church of Saint Spas has remained the most, in a way, relevant memory site in North Macedonia, uncontested mostly to this day. Also, the very fact that the public service confirmed his status as the most revered historical figure in North Macedonia served in a way to leverage political agendas by legitimizing one and delegitimizing other sort of political programs. So it's, in a way, it's pretty obvious that public sentiment towards history and memory issues hardened in this kind of past few years. And this was exactly the reason why we conducted these 6 focus groups in September last year with the colleagues from the Center for the Research of Nationalisms and Cultures in Skopje, in a way to test this sort of how these new developments pertaining to history and memory are in a way resonating with this wider social core, if I may. It's also important to note that this focus group were kind of reflective of the local demographics, right? So there were like separate focus group with Albanians, separate with Macedonians of different generations, and in a way, of course, reflecting also the gender perspectives. So what we did was that we departed from this commonplace that historical events and figures hold diverse meanings for different individuals and communities, and this again for different reasons, of course. So our analytical lens was therefore closer to the sociology of knowledge and its emphasis on the social conditions of knowledge production and dissemination, than to this kind of more traditional theory of historiography, which also in a way deals to a certain extent with these issues. So from our vantage point, the focus group discussions offer this sort of valuable insights into the range of meaning-making techniques and interpretative strategies these sort of participants or the locals employ in this kind of areas of shared understanding and even contestation about history issues. And focus groups, in a way, and I'm not going to speak about this sort of methodological issues, of course, but focus groups kind of appear to be very, very fitting tools for this experiment, in a way, because they allowed for this sort of allowed for mapping shared and unshared patterns of understandings. So what were some of the major patterns in this regards that we identified and which concern these sort of bilateral relation issues that we discussed today? So first, that again, there was this pretty widespread relativization of the very notion of historical truth. In our case, this tendency did not primarily reflect an openness to the coexistence of multiple historical perspectives, but rather it was this pervasive belief that history is inevitably mediated, and as one participant put it, distorted, so by various actors, both foreign, domestic, and including again with the help facilitated by political and religious institutions. So this idea of not being able to access some sort of alleged historical truth was something which we kind of seen in this light of a relativization, and this was an underlying, this was a kind of a very common trope which we kind of found, and we eventually linked with some of the major political developments from the past years. What was also seemingly very paradoxical in this context was the fact that this sort of earlier Yugoslav state approach to history was frequently invoked as a contrasting example of how a state should actually manage historical education and public memory. And the context here, of course, being that leverage this sort of non-aligned Yugoslav state of the mid and the late Cold War had over this kind of other regional states. It's in a way kind of resonates as something which is not necessarily a model to follow, but in a way another contrasting case which was frequently again brought up by the participants. Another interesting point in this regards was that this perception was shared among all groups, including Macedonian and Albanian participants, and this again is another kind of contradictory statement, in seemingly contradictory, because as we all know that the history of the Yugoslav Albanians is not as straightforward as the history of the other predominantly Slavic groups in the country. So in a way, this was a very interesting way of seeing how people think about what history, memory, politics should entail, and what they should not entail, and how they should, in a way, position towards other sort of other states' demands and so on. So the second point, which we found very interesting, was that this idea of whom people concern authority in terms of history and memory related issues, and again, the one straightforward answer were the state institutions, but surprisingly enough for us, political parties emerged as most credible kind of sources in this regards, and then followed by sort of professional historians, and of course individuals, maybe not necessarily historians, but individuals from the participants' own social circles, and this required further research and unpacking, of course. But it was, and we noted this, it was kind of striking for us to see how history teachers are kind of losing their role as some sort of authorities in terms of history education, even within this kind of vaguely formed rankings of ours at this particular point and research, of course. So, and thirdly and finally, we noted that there is a strong tendency to alternative histories, and in particular the work of pseudo-historians or documentaries centered on some sort of global conspiracies. And this, while this kind of seems concerning on the first hand, we kind of even try to see it differently a bit in our analysis, and this is one of the points which I will kind of try to develop right now a bit more in some of this kind of longer summarizing perspective, which I will try to kind of paint at right now. So to summarize this venture into broadly speaking, this sort of public discourse and its reception once this sort of escalation started between the two states. The first point kind of goes back to this role of the public intellectuals, and it kind of resonates with this very simple question of what takes eventually for two states to put behind some sort of a conflict over history and memory. And in this very banal sense, the shortest of the answers pertains certainly these three elements, which in a way kind of also stem from this recent European context of bilateral reconciliation, especially over issues of history. And this is this kind of combination of a social and especially political will, strategic reconciliation schemes, and a bare consensus about the common prospects, of course. And these things, of course, get more complicated in practice. as all these such conflicts are context-based, while the sustainability of the reconciliation process usually takes a shape of an idiosyncratic model developed over time. And this again, and you probably have a lot to say on this point. This does not mean that there are no setbacks in these processes, and that there is like once for all remedy for solving such conflicts. In a way, what and I pretty much agree with the statement of the Professor Ulf Brumbauer, who is very much an expert in this particular kind of regional setting. He, in a way, deems this sort of epistemological fallacy of national unambiguity, which finds the plural interpretation of historical events, and that this certainly something which can exist side by side, as something problematic. So this, in a way, this epistemological fallacy is something which, in a way, is something which intellectuals should first domesticate and then be able to kind of re-articulate it for the wider public, mostly pertaining to the national context. So despite all the tensions, mine and our, in a way, argument with Ivan is that Macedonian intellectuals, by and large, failed to distinguish this sort of partisan agenda on one hand and this intellectual agenda on the other, and recognize the Commission as some sort of a legitimate or semi-legitimate platform and a fair site for deliberation about contested historical events and figures. Needless to say, this is a relative minority in our two-state context. Let's put it this way. So, but nevertheless, we kind of aim at using other comparative cases, and then still we try to argue the merits of it. The second point pertains to these public commemorative events and the fact that they, in a way, bear this interesting potential for impacting public opinion on different points. On the one hand, as you kind of already heard, the case of Delchev's commemorations demonstrates that they can definitely forge public coalitions over certain issues using symbolic maneuvers into this sort of already pre-given ritualistic structure. So on the other hand, this study of ours, which we did with the focus groups, revealed that public commemorations and especially public holidays marking historical events are rapidly losing their significance in the national and especially the local context of Skopje, which in turn does not mean, and it cannot be kind of equalized by saying that people's history in general, people's interest in history in general is decreasing. This, in a way, is not something which we argue, and we, in a way, try to posit as some sort of a different argument, and which kind of says more or less that this lower credibility of formal education in North Macedonia and the other Balkan states makes pupils more vulnerable to certain public interpretations of historical events which might not necessarily follow basic democratic standards. And in these regards, we again turn to intellectuals and researchers, and we kind of argue that it's their role primarily to discover those gaps in the given local contexts and in a way articulate policy suggestions, but not to stop there and engage further on more and more and increasingly as these public historians so in a way to democratize this historiographic knowledge to as many as possible and in as many formats as possible. And third and finally, I mean, this is something which maybe I would like to even hear from you more, is how this, in a way, how this very short episode and very recent and short episode resonates with this topic of European values, and how it can be, in a way, posited so it can kind of inform some sort of a better understanding of what is happening on a wider cross-regional level. And on the one hand, I mean, we can go into a more technical kind of discussion into EU conditionality and how this sort of things are changing over time, and how this sort of very particular bilateral dispute is informing those changes, what can be anticipated here, how this sort of idea that bilateral tensions over history and memory can, in a way, translate into some sort of a not very clear structure of the very integration process. Something which, of course, functions as such, and it's relatively well debated on several kind of policy levels. But on the other hand, it's also, in a way, from a more of a axiological perspective, it's also kind of a very telling case, I believe, about what actually European values are constituting nowadays, and to which extent we can kind of expect that the national, allegedly, perspectives are suggesting, what are they showing, and to which extent they're legitimate and can be kind of seen as some sort of a structuring factor in terms of this sort of bilateral relations on several levels, but mostly social ones. So I'll stop here. I hope it was clear enough, and yeah, I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and comments. Thank you.